The soft chime of the clock in the small, dimly lit room echoed, marking the beginning of another hour. An old widow sits quietly at her oak dining table, a worn letter clutched in her trembling hands. The paper bore the emblem of the United States Pension Office. Her eyes, once bright with youth, now clouded with the weight of years and loss, scanned the words again, seeking clarity in the bureaucratic language. The widow's late husband, once a Union soldier in the Civil War, passed away, leaving her with memories and a modest home and a family, but little else. It was only now in her twilight years that she discovered a new lifeline, his military pension. Yet the letter from the pension office was not a confirmation of her request. There was a demand for more information. Uh-oh. The pension office insistence on details long buried stirred a deep unease within her. But she had to confront the ghost of her husband's past to secure her future. With a determined breath, she readies herself to embark on a journey through her husband's hidden history. The path ahead was uncertain, marked by shadows of love and loss. I'm Karyn Harding, an amateur genealogist, and I've spent an embarrassing amount of time and money unlocking the stories of the people who had to exist for me to exist.
And I'm Kim McMasters, a millennial with no interest in history, having kids, or leaving a legacy of my own.
And you're listening to Low Ancestry. Each episode, I'll share one story from my family tree with Kim, proving that ordinary people like me, with ordinary ancestry like mine, have compelling and sometimes scandalous or heartbreaking stories buried within them. Welcome back, Kim.
Welcome back, Karyn.
Today's story is sort of a two-parter, part one and part two, but I'll be doing 2 episodes on 3 generations of one family. So this episode is on the older generation. The next episode will be on the younger generation. This is a family who had a lot going on personally.
But it's unlike the other families that we've talked about so far.
Well, I know about this one. Oh, so it's going to be crazy. Oh, it's also a story that gives us a unique insight into the myriad of family troubles that probably were plaguing a number of other households during this time period, and more specifically, troubles that had a profound and disproportionate impact on women. And what excites me about this episode and the next episode is that it contains a lot of details about the lives of women in this family.
Finally.
I know, it's something that very frustratingly does not happen often when studying genealogy. And I've talked about this before, but my family was pretty poor in past generation, and that makes it especially hard to find records for the women who are in these poor families. So it's why I was thrilled to stumble across records about them and find more about their personal lives. So I have somewhat rare details on the lives of these women. The caveat is that the details usually come at the price of strife, hardship, tragedy.
Yep.
In the lives of those same women. I don't have access to these details because they all live normal and eventful and happy lives. So that's the caveat.
Okay.
So it's exciting. We'll get to talk at length about the women in my family tree in a way that we haven't really been able to do. But the stories I'm telling, without exception, exist because they suffered. So let's jump in.
I can't wait.
Good. So let's start with the oldest generation of the 3 generations that I'm talking about for our 2-part series. And this story will paint us a picture of what the average American household was dealing with before, during, and after the Civil War. Well, the average Union household at any rate.
A very important distinction.
A very important distinction. And can you really call the Confederate households American households since they literally seceded?
No, you can't.
And this is what it looked like through the lives of 2 very different women. The well-behaved and the ill-behaved.
Oh, I love them both.
Yeah.
I'll take any.
And while we're at it, we're also going to get into the exciting world of bureaucratic red tape. which has been plaguing American citizens since forever. The best place for us to start is in 1858 with the marriage of a woman named Helen Skinner and James Franklin Dewey. He goes by Frank. Helen and Frank are my fourth great-grandparents through my dad's family. And I think it's worth noting that it's my grandpa's family. And I say that because by now you know that most of the episodes of this season have been about my grandpa's family.
Yep.
And that's not because I have favoritism, although he is the coolest. The reason is because his family's so messy.
Yeah.
It's so messy. None more so than this family, the Deweys. Let's get back to Helen and Frank.
Okay.
Helen and Frank both live in Sydney, New York. Helen's family has been connected to this small town since its founding, while Frank moved away from his family in Massachusetts to find new opportunities in New York State. They both find each other, court, and then agree to marry in 1858. Some other things that were happening in 1858 were Minnesota becomes a 32nd state.
Okay.
And Denver, Colorado is just founded.
Okay. Two very cool places.
There's
a fan of both.
I think great. I haven't been to Denver, but I've heard things.
Yeah.
There's actually a civil war in Mexico right now over the clashing of conservative and liberal ideals, making the American Civil War kind of look like a copycat job.
Okay, so the Mexican one comes first.
Yeah, and like everything America does, we pretend like we're the ones who found it.
Yeah, like we did it and ours is the most important.
Exactly. India engages in a critical rebellion against the British East India Trading Company.
Let's go.
Soon-to-be President Abe Lincoln gives his famous House Divided speech about the disunion over slavery in America.
Okay.
And on this exact day of Helen and Frank's marriage, August 2nd, 1858, a bill is passed in London to create the modern sewage system as a result of what is called the Great Stink.
This is the best day of my life.
It's so fun. I'm not going to get into it, but it was just like this one summer that was like so stanky.
Like the stinkiest summer.
The stinkiest summer of all time that they're like, should we create a new sewage system?
It's a good year.
It's a good year.
Oh, that's incredible.
So let's get back to Helen and Frank's wedding day. Like I said, it was August 2nd. So it's a hot summer day in August, but the couple is excited because they're not the only ones getting married today. Helen's sister, Susan, is getting married to Frank's brother, Josiah. So it's two brothers and two sisters going to elope together.
Oh, wow.
And it's so cute.
What are the odds of that happening?
Of the two brothers and the two sisters?
Yeah.
I mean, in small town 1850s America,
it's a really good point.
I think maybe pretty likely, actually.
Yeah. Okay, whoops.
Not a lot to choose from, I would say.
No, I suppose not.
The four of them travel from Sydney, New York, to a place called South New Berlin, also in New York, to all get hitched. They're eloping. Once at the church, the couples take their vows, Helen and Frank first, and then Susan and Josiah. Afterward, the Reverend asks a few questions for the marriage certificate: names, parents' names, date of birth, any previous marriages.
Mm-hmm.
All of them quickly say this is their first marriage, except for Frank. He says it's his second. He was married a few years before, but don't worry, she passed away shortly after they got married, so there's no reason that him and Helen should not get married. Helen has heard about this first wife, so she's not surprised to hear about it.
Thank God. I was ready for for everything to go awry.
Frank assured Helen about this marriage when he asked Helen to marry him. His first wife, whose name was Harriet Tuttle, had died. It was tragic, but now Frank had Helen, and she was going to build a life with him, keeping house for him and building a family together. After the wedding, Josiah and Sarah go back home to Sydney, while Frank and Helen actually continue to live in kind of in the same area in a town called Sherburne, New York, where Frank's parents had been living. And they just live there until the next spring while Frank works there.
Can I make a prediction? Because it's in my head. It's not going to come out.
I can tell your gears are working.
Yeah, can you see that I'm just like, I know what's happening
Yeah,
here.
tell me, what's your prediction?
Tuttle's not dead.
I will neither confirm nor deny.
Okay. Incredible.
But I am doing a lot of foreshadowing here. Yeah. Obviously,
you do tell a story.
I hope that Helen was really ready to build that family with Frank because they start pretty quickly. Oof. On February 14th, 1859, on Valentine's Day, no less, Helen gives birth to a baby boy named Charles.
Is that the February after they get married?
Oh, yes. Oh, so you're already doing
I'm doing the math.
You've already done the math.
I love numbers.
I don't want to cast aspersions, but
no judgment at all. But I can put some pieces together.
That's 7 months.
7 months, and that's not.
Sure. Could have been a premature labor.
Yeah. It happens all the time.
But please. Don't you think it's a little funny that they only live in this new town that's away from the town that they had been living in until the next spring? You know, about as long as it would take for a 9-month pregnancy to take.
Yup.
So take that however you will.
I'm taking it.
Helen, do your thing, girl.
Yeah, go off.
Go off, queen. They go back to Sydney, New York as a 3-person family.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually move into the house right next to Helen's parents. Frank works as a farm laborer, and in the 1860 census, his personal estate is worth $25, which is about $950 in today's money. But the Deweys continue to grow their family with another baby boy, who happens to be my third great-grandfather, Fred. He was born March of 1861, the same month that Abraham Lincoln was sworn into office as president.
Wow.
And as we all know, 1 month later, what happens? In April of 1861.
What does happen?
The Civil War starts in 1861. Confederate forces open fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. That's the start of it. Charleston is a long way off from the farm town of Sydney, New York, and other places like it across the north. But the attack on a Union-held fort did spark something of a patriotic spirit among the northern states. And when the call came from Lincoln's government for 75,000 volunteer troops, the quota was quickly filled. And Fred Dewey was one of those first volunteers to join the Union Army, as he enlisted in August of 1862, which is still kind of within that beginning range when the war was in full swing. And he was one of the many volunteers who went out as like a personal duty to the country, volunteering of his own accord alongside his brother Josiah and Helen's brother Levi, who enlisted the same day and in the same regiment. The only reason I note that Frank enlisted at this time is that the first year of the war, the Union started to have some trouble getting enough volunteers to fight, like after this initial wave. And as a reaction to that, there was a national draft that came out from Washington in the Conscription Act of 1863, which was America's first draft.
Cool.
And it was very unpopular.
Yeah.
I don't want to fall down the rabbit hole too far, but this draft was unpopular, and why it was bad is that it allowed for a $300 price to be paid in place of service. So that meant that it disproportionately affected the poor.
Yeah.
Who are often migrants or freedmen of color.
Ugh.
Or like my family, who had a very limited estate. A lot of men fled to Canada, or they joined the army and then deserted. And there was even in New York City at this time a riot among Irish migrants who had recently become citizens just before the election in 1861, specifically to elect Abe Lincoln. And then when they realized that they were now, as voting citizens responsible for conscription, they absolutely lit New York City up and were so mad about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, a lot of historians agree that the North wouldn't have won without the Conscription Act. So I'll leave that discussion to them, but it's a tough thing to think about.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
Back to Frank. He enlists before the draft, and he leaves Helen and their family in September of 1862. And he doesn't return until after June of 1865, 3 months after the surrender at Appomattox. Helen, at this point, has had to send her husband off to war, not knowing whether or not he would ever come back. And she's left to care for their 2 children. And then, whoops, Helen's pregnant again.
Oh.
And I did the math, and it looks like Helen likely got pregnant just before Frank left, right under the wire, timing-wise. So this is their third baby boy while Frank is off fighting in the summer of 1863. So there are no records that I found of Helen during the time that Frank is away from home, other than the birth of her son. So I can't really speak to what she got up to. I do know that sometime between 1860 and 1865, her mother dies. Or rather, her mother is no longer recorded in her father's house, which I assume means that she passed. I mean, we don't know, but it's more statistically likely that that's what happened.
Sure. With the Conscription Act, what was given to the families of the men who were drafted? Like, were they given any sort of support?
No, the men were paid.
Okay.
To be in the military.
And then just sent that back home, I suppose.
Yes. I will talk a little bit about how the women got on, but the men did get paid. And then later in the early 1890s is the first time that a military pension act was brought to Congress.
Okay, so I'm right on track.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. So this was a complaint among veterans, and they did end up with pension acts.
Got it.
So there isn't a lot to know about Helen specifically during these years, but I can speak to what the nation's women were getting up to based on collective diaries, letters, and other personal writings that historians have used to answer the question.
Here we go.
A small amount of women mobilized either as nurses or aides in Washington, but they were usually younger or unmarried.
Mm-hmm.
And then similarly, around 500 to 1,000 women, actually, the exact number is not known, fought the war disguised as men.
Let's go.
Those stories are so interesting.
I say let's go as in like, go women, go be off, do your thing, gender equality, and also like, I hate war.
Yeah, war.
I don't know if that needs to be said.
Well, I feel like it's the same thing as when we hear about like women serial killers or something, where it's like, not good, but I guess break that glass ceiling.
Yeah, we get it, but like don't. But also don't.
Anyway, they're really interesting stories, and that would be a fun thing for you to tell me about as well.
Okay, great.
More common during this time were married women or older women left to take care of the homes, children, and sometimes family businesses by themselves.
Oof.
And this experience was varied as, you know, every woman was in a different situation, poor or rich, middle class. Many of them would start aid foundations in their hometowns to help the men off at war. So they would collect food, they would sew items, things like that.
Little Women.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what was happening. Writings left by women during this time tell us that this was a time marked by incredible hardship for women. So unless the men wrote letters from service back home about what they were doing or where they were headed, the ones left behind had no idea where they were.
Oof.
And when they were coming home, or even if they were alive, it's incredibly lonely.
Oh.
Helen and Frank, as far as I know, did not learn to read or write. So it's even less likely that she would have known anything. She's lonely. A lot of women were lonely at this time, and it's a time without much income. So without men to engage in labor or other tasks or occupations that were prohibited to women, housewives and mothers were left to kind of just figure out how to feed their children and keep their homes. Like they still weren't really allowed to be laborers or things like that.
Cool.
Yeah, very cool, very tight. So I think it's safe to assume that that's what life looked like for Helen, a very difficult time. And it remained that way until the end of the war in 1865. In fact, by the time the war had ended, Frank actually hadn't been discharged from service yet when the war ended. He isn't discharged until June 25th, 1865. So there's maybe even a chance that she didn't know if he had like survived the war until he like showed up on her doorstep.
Well, how quickly would word have gotten back to her that the war was over?
Not quickly, I don't think. Well, she would have known that the war was over. That would have been in like newspapers.
Yeah, okay.
That would have been quickly. But like mail was not fast.
No.
Certainly. Well, actually, you know what a great example of that is? The surrender at Appomattox was April 9th, 1865. And then Abraham Lincoln was assassinated April 15th. But the final enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation, as we know, was in Texas on June 19th, which was Juneteenth. And word did not travel that the Civil War had ended in Texas until June. So that sort of answers your question.
Whoa.
Yeah.
What a trip.
Yeah. History, folks.
Am I starting to like it?
Hey, all you needed was someone to make it interesting. Someone who's cute, someone who's perfect, someone who's witty.
And I've found her.
And it's me.
It's you. And you're very comfortable giving yourself all of those descriptors.
Did you hear how I just got quieter and quieter?
So teeny tiny and small.
A lot happens between the end of the war and when Frank finally makes it home. So let's hope Helen was getting updates somehow, but we don't know.
No, probably not.
But he does come home. And I'd like to rewind a little bit to kind of see what Frank was doing during these years apart. What was he doing in the war? We have no records of Helen, but we do have Frank's records.
Of course we do.
Yeah, we have his military records. Frank, his brother and his brother-in-law were all privates in the 144th New York Regiment, Company I. And they got up to all sorts of military things that are actually relatively interesting. The first year of Frank's service, he and his regiment hopped around Eastern Virginia, including DC and Suffolk. And they were just there to serve as like defense for Union territory. But the most interesting part of his service, in my opinion, was in the next year where his regiment hung out on Follies Island near Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Union soldiers were bound and determined to get Fort Sumter back from the Confederates because it was like kind of a symbol of the war even starting.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like a symbol of how the Union was doing.
Right.
And they really were determined.
Big pride.
Big pride. So from Follies Island, which is really close by, you can see Fort Sumter from there. For like a year, the Union just kept shooting at Fort Sumter. And they nearly decimated the fort, but they still never recaptured it. So they were just like slowly like disintegrating it and still never got it back.
Just think about like the torture of that though, of like being at the fort.
Being at the fort.
Just like watching it crumble around you.
Psychological torture.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until after the surrender at Appomattox that the Union got Fort Sumter back. But Frank's regiment was gone by that time, but they spent some time on Follies Island. During the last part of his service, Frank was assigned actually to be a nurse on an Army hospital ship called the Cosmopolitan. It's such a great name. It was parked like near Savannah, Georgia. What I've learned from his pension records was that he quickly went from nurse to patient because he had the what's called a goo, which is just like old timey speak for fever and like shivering fits. So actually, Frank spent most of that time getting treated for illnesses while he was in service. He had a goo. That sounds wrong now. Egg or a goo. But he was also treated nonstop for diarrhea.
Cool.
Asthma.
Cool.
Rheumatism.
Incredible.
Which means his little joints hurt.
Yeah. Oh, believe me, I'm familiar.
Yeah, we all got the rheumatism. And when Frank comes home in 1865, physically, he's actually never the same. In doctor's reports found in his pension file, Frank's rheumatism and asthma prohibited him from working the same amount as he had before the war. So the labor jobs that he had primarily used to provide for his family were just not really, I mean, he still did them, but they weren't as good for him anymore.
So war had a bad effect on the person serving it? That's crazy.
That's so wild.
What a wild thought.
That's so crazy.
That is shocking to me.
But he does keep working. He has to.
Well, yeah.
Because he's got a big family and that family grows significantly.
So how many children are we up to at this point?
Right now, I think 3. And then when he comes home, like the 4th one comes pretty soon after. But between the years of 1866 and 1882, Helen and Frank have 7 more children.
7 more?
7 more. So if you add those to the kids before the war, you've got 10 kids.
Holy.
Those are just the ones who survived into adulthood. So there may have been others who did not. And actually, I did the math on the age gap between the children and like how old Helen was. So the age gap between Helen's youngest and her oldest is 23 years. So when she has her last kid, she's 44 years old, which is like, whoa.
Whoa.
Not even a moment of respite for this poor woman.
That is nonstop.
It's nonstop.
Good golly.
I know. So Frank does have to keep working. And the different jobs I've seen him have was day laborer, farmhand. And in some accounts, he's actually listed as a stonemason. Like I saw a newspaper article where he was helping build a bridge in town,
cool.
like a stone bridge. So that's great. But for a guy with bad joints.
Yeah, ouch.
But despite probably being a very chaotic life with all of these kids, it actually seems very uneventful from like a record standpoint. So nothing big happens, nothing crazy. The children all grow up, they get married, they have children of their own. Frank and Helen's son, Fred, my third great grandfather, gets married to a woman named Carrie White, who I talk about in the next episode. And that's just 2 years after Helen's youngest is born, actually. So Helen's youngest is 2 years old when Fred gets married.
Whoa.
Isn't that crazy to think about? For all intents and purposes, it seems like life is pretty normal, pretty nice in Sydney, New York. And something I've always loved about researching this family, like Helen and Frank specifically, is there's actually some pictures found of them, which is not often because during this time, like it wasn't a popular thing at this time. But I learned that Helen's brother, Levi, who I talked about joining with Frank, he became a photographer.
Oh.
And that explains a little bit of how we get these photos of the Dewey family. So I'm going to show you a few. Here's Frank and Helen as they're a little bit older. So I'm going to show you that.
These are some sweet faces.
Aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're very sweet.
I've always thought that too. Like they have, like usually people scowl in old pictures.
Yeah.
And
They both kind of have like a softness.
they do.
The Frank on the left
Yeah.
has a nice beard, a bit of a buzzy buzz cut.
Yeah. Maybe an army cut even.
An army cut. Yeah, it could be. I don't know. Very soft eyes. And then Helen looks like she's about to make a joke.
Doesn't she kind of look like the character from Howl's Moving Castle when like she becomes
Yes,
old?
absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I love it. And
Just
these
kinda
are
sweet.
surprisingly like detailed.
Yeah, I guess Levi was a pretty good photographer.
Go off, Levi.
Here's an interesting side note. Levi dies of poisoning.
Whoa.
I shouldn't laugh. Sorry. Let me say that in a serious way. Levi ends up dying of poisoning, which is very sad, but also very uncommon.
What? How?
I can't remember, and I should have been more prepared.
I wonder what he ate or who he made angry.
I know.
It's one of those two,
It's one
right?
of those two. Maybe I'll do a bonus episode about it.
Yeah.
There's also another picture of the Dewey family. You can see Frank and Helen in the middle.
This is so many human beings.
I know. My guess, I don't know who all the people are, but my guess is that the whole back row are like the children. Because I think there's almost,
Oh, yeah.
there's almost 10.
Yeah. It's a lot of men.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that she had 9 boys and 1 girl.
Whoa.
I know.
Poor girl.
I know. That's too many.
That is too many.
That's too many boys.
Wow.
So I think that a lot of the women sitting are like the wives, and then obviously the children are the children they started having.
I really hope that our listeners go to look at this photo, because a lot of the people, I would say potentially most of the people in this photo look extremely unhappy. And Helen looks like she's beaming with pride.
I know. I feel like Helen was probably just the nicest person.
She was probably a wonderful mother and grandmother.
I think like the picture of just her and then the picture with all of her children and grandchildren, she just looks happy.
Yeah, there's such a sweetness.
Yeah.
And everybody else looks absolutely miserable.
Like I've said 1,000 times before on this podcast, you can't assume to know what people are feeling unless they say it for themselves in like a diary or letter. But even without knowing their intent, they just seem happy with their family. And they sort of look like they are living the American dream.
Yeah.
And there's something nice about seeing this very uncomplicated kind of like domestic happiness in a time when like we've talked about so many stories that are not like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to fully pull the rug out from under you, just a little bit.
Just a little, just a corner.
Like all humans, Fred and Helen age. Their health declines significantly. And fortunately for him, in 1890, the U.S. government passes the Disability Act, which meant that any soldier who served a certain amount of time in the war and has a disability, which obviously we know Frank did,
Yeah.
can receive a monthly pension for the government. So Fred, with his multiple health issues, applies for the pension. He's easily approved, which must have been a relief in his old age that he can still provide for his family. But when he passes, his widows and dependents can continue to receive his pension according to the Widows Pension Act that was released later. So when Fred finally passes in 1908, after a long period of sickness, Helen does exactly what she's supposed to do. She applies for the widow's pension to continue receiving money from the government as recompense for her husband's service. Should have been easy. Her husband had been approved for it, and she was his lawful widow. What could be simpler?
Oh, Frank.
Of course it wasn't simple, Kim.
You sneaky dog.
After Helen submits her application, she can't provide her marriage certificate. She says that it was burned in a house fire. So her and the U.S. government do a back and forth for 5 years until one day she receives a letter from the Department of the Interior stating that her case is subject to special examination due to the suspicious circumstances of Helen's marriage to Frank. And her husband's pension payments are directed to stop until the examination comes to conclusion.
Oh, no.
And all of this is because of a lie that Frank told Helen way back in 1858, which is that his wife had died. She had not. You were right, Kim. Frank, you buffoon.
They looked so happy.
They probably were happy.
And soft.
The only leeway I give Frank here is divorces are expensive. And also frowned upon immensely.
That's fair.
And so I'll tell you what happens with his first wife, and you can kind of decide, Frank, but a simple boy, whether or not he meant harm.
I think, no, I'll let you tell me first. Big thoughts.
Do you want to predict something though?
No, I don't know if I have a prediction about the other marriage.
Yeah.
I do think that even if divorces were expensive and frowned upon, you could have told your wife.
Yeah.
Should have told your wife. New wife.
I will say, I think it's in Helen's pension. She says that she didn't know, but there's maybe a chance that she knew.
Yeah, that's
right?
true. Yeah.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And I think like this bigamy situation happened a lot. And that's because people didn't want to get divorces. So they just, if you lived with him, I mean, common law marriages were accepted in a lot of states.
Yeah.
So they just went with it. So it's not totally crazy, but it is crazy.
Wow.
So the U.S. government thought that it looked like Helen was fraudulently trying to get pension money when she wasn't Frank's wife.
Oh.
She was just some woman who cohabitated with Frank until his death and
had 10 children with him.
And had 10 children. But cohabitated is the exact word that the special examiner used.
Well.
I think it's a lot.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine what that must have felt like to Helen. Like, she's 76 years old.
Oh, so degrading.
She's lived through a war without her husband and birthed 10 children, like you said, and then took special care of him with all of his ailments. And after all of that, she just wants her $12 a month and not to be a burden to her children.
$12 a month?
Yeah, I have a inflation calculator thing. That's about $370 today. So still not great.
Super not great.
But because of a lie that Frank told when she was 20, she has to go through a lengthy investigation.
I would be so mad. Or, I mean, this is assuming she actually doesn't know. If she knew, like, you made your bed.
Yeah.
If she doesn't know, I'd be so mad.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you just rethink your whole life?
I'd be so angry at him. So the special examination into Frank's 2 marriages consists of around 20 depositions that last about 4 months, like, to collect all of them. And the special examiner actually tells Helen that she has, quote, the privilege of being present during the special examination. Like, she could sit in there, either her or her attorney. But can you imagine sitting in the room while a bunch of people talk about the woman that, like, your husband lied to you about? Can you?
Actually, I can't imagine.
Oh, no, yeah. Oh.
That is, so degrading.
Yeah.
So degrading. Surely she's not the only woman this has ever happened to. Surely this has happened many times. I guarantee
it's happened many times.
But God, what a terrible thing.
She did have a lawyer, so I do wonder if they sat in the room instead of her. Yeah. I mean, she's pretty old. Like, she's not going to sit through all those depositions. I hope not anyway.
Yeah.
Be so for real right now with making her do that. So the actual story is really juicy, but to know that story, we have to go back in time again, back before Helen and Frank's life, before the Civil War, and before their marriage. And this whole story had me questioning what I knew about Frank. So to know that, I even went back further to Frank's beginning. He was born as James Franklin Dewey in 1834 to Josiah and Polly Dewey in New Ashford, Massachusetts, where he lives until he's about 17 years old.
Okay.
At 17, he leaves Massachusetts to go live in South New Berlin, New York.
Okay.
Which should sound familiar as the town where he gets married to Helen.
Mm-hmm.
It's never explicitly stated why Frank chooses South New Berlin to live in, but we do know that he starts working at a cabinet shop there. Frank's father is a carpenter back in Massachusetts, so it's possible that Frank gets an apprenticeship through that and learns how to do exactly the same thing. Not far from South New Berlin is a town called Morris, where Frank meets a young woman called Harriet Tuttle. Harriet has actually been having kind of a tough life by the time Frank meets her.
Oh, and he makes it all better?
Probably not. She was the youngest, born to her father's wife, Catherine. And since I can't find any records of Harriet's mother, all I can say for certain is that Harriet is born in 1841. And by the time it's 1844, Harriet's father has found a new wife and a new son, Harriet's half brother.
Okay.
So in a very short span of time, she does not have a mother. She now has like a different family.
Okay.
It's probably likely that she never even knew her mother.
Yeah.
So Harriet's father dies when she's 10 or 11.
Oof.
And the children are split up among other family members. According to Harriet's half-brother, Charles, none of the half-siblings ever saw each other again.
Oh, man.
She moves to Morris and lives with an uncle. And according to her cousin, she was working, quote, working for different ones down there. I don't know what that means. Like maybe it just means odd jobs that she was doing. So she's an orphaned preteen doing domestic work. And that sucks.
Yeah.
Probably in late 1854, she meets Frank. She's 13 years old. He's 20. So I have no details or records about this time.
Oh, no.
I just know that by 1855, they're married.
And she's how old in 1855?
14. Take it all in.
I wish I didn't have to.
I know. I hated reading this.
Oh, no.
The only thing I'll say is that I don't have exact confirmation of Harriet's birth year. It's sort of implied that it's 1841.
I mean, it's not looking good.
It's not looking. So what is that? It might even give us just like 1 or 2 years later. That's still not amazing. I don't love it.
Not good.
No. Here we are.
Ugh.
But according to Harriet's cousin, Harriet and Frank actually never lived together. She was boarding at her uncle's house.
Okay.
And then he was boarding near the furniture factory where he worked. So Frank would just visit Morris occasionally to see her. This goes on for about a year and a half. And again, we don't know what happens during that time.
Something about this doesn't sit well with me.
I don't have the details and I can't fill that out for you. The only thing we do know by the end of this year or year and a half, Harriet leaves Frank and she leaves her family in Morris and she leaves with a man named Gilbert Rockwell. In all the depositions taken by the special examiner about Frank's first marriage, no one can give a solid reason for her leaving. They don't say what her intentions were.
Maybe because he's a creep?
It could be. Gilbert's older too, so they're all creeps.
Oh, God. Go home.
Yeah. The best we have is her cousin's account of things. And I do have this as a quote that you can read, Kim. I'm kind of excited about this.
Oh, gosh.
This is how her cousin describes her. Can you read that?
She left him because she thought she could do better. She was a bad one. She was one of the worst that I ever knew. That is incredible.
I love that he said that on record.
She was a bad one. She was one of the worst that I ever knew.
Put that on your tombstone.
I live. I hope she gave everyone a big old middle finger and just
out of town.
Yeah.
In the final report given by the special examiner to the Department of the Interior, he states his opinion that Harriet's cousin actually has a questionable reputation and that his account should never be fully trusted. So take everything he says with a grain of salt.
I'm taking everything everyone says all the time with a grain of salt.
We can't look at this situation, I think, without looking at all of its context, obviously, which I don't need to explain to you, which is that she gets married as like a literal child. She leaves Frank and runs off with this guy named Gilbert. So she's still a teenager. Oh, and Gilbert's even older than Frank, by the way. So when Gilbert meets Harriet, he's around 25 years old.
It's like a really bad remake of When Harry Met Sally.
It is. It's not good.
It's icky.
Harriet's prefrontal cortex is not even developed.
Oh, boy.
And she's already had a difficult life up to this point, and her actual husband doesn't even live with her. I can think of a million reasons why she would bolt.
Yeah.
As for Gilbert, we don't know much about him before he runs away with Harriet. I know that he was born in New York State, but I don't know where, and I don't know anything about his family or why he was in Morris. According to Harriet's niece in her deposition later in life, she thought Gilbert worked for the government and did something like painting ships. And I'm not so sure that that's true, because later in an 1870 census, Gilbert reports his occupation as a huckster, which is a person who travels from place to place selling random bits and bobs.
Oh.
Like a traveling salesman.
Got another grifter in our midst.
In my over imaginative head, I picture the guy from The Music Man coming into town. 100%.
Yeah.
So
what is his name? Harold Hill.
Yeah, you should know this.
I should know that. It should have come to me much faster.
Harold Hill.
It's kind of fun to think about her latching on to that and maybe even using him for that.
Yeah. I don't think she chose well.
No.
We'll get to it, but she didn't choose a good one. But maybe it is like this handsome young man. He waltzes into the small town of New York, convinces everyone he's like a big shot government employee. He woos this young, unhappy woman into believing that he can save her, and off they go. Whatever the reason, Harriet leaves with him, and everyone thinks they run off west. And then Frank is left to, quote, pick up the pieces. And I can imagine that his reputation probably took a pretty big hit. So I think it's no wonder that Frank lies about Harriet to everyone around him. In a very disconnected world like the 1850s, it was probably easy to disappear, reappear, or lie about one thing or another.
Oh, yeah.
So as far as I know, Frank never goes back to Morris. He goes and reinvents himself in Sydney, New York as a widower. And who would be able to prove him wrong?
Yeah.
So I don't think he does the lying maliciously when he meets and courts Helen. I think he realizes that the only way he could marry her is if he's granted a divorce or if Harriet's dead.
Yeah.
So divorce costly, it's public. Plus, how could he find Harriet to finalize the divorce? So if Harriet ran off west, who's to say she isn't dead? In 1858, he takes Helen to New South Berlin and they get married under the pretext of his dead first wife. And if I put my conspiracy hat on,
tell me.
I sort of think he marries Helen in New South Berlin because he has connections there. Any other officiant might have done like due diligence about his legal ability to get married again.
Yes.
I don't know how rigorous the process was in 1858, but I know you couldn't just say you're free to marry and Bob's your uncle. I wonder if like this place, he could find like friends to back up his story.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Again, you're probably right. Like lying probably was not meant as like a malicious thing. Marrying a 13-year-old could be.
Yeah, not my favorite thing.
Doing a dupe on your new wife, still not okay.
Not great. Not okay and not great. So what little we know of the story of Harriet is that her life never gets better. And that's really heartbreaking.
Meanwhile, Helen looks so happy with her 10 kids.
I know.
Now I feel really bad for Harriet.
Just feel bad for women is really the moral of this story.
That's just all of them.
But this is where we transition, I think, from the life of the well-behaved woman to the life of the ill-behaved woman. After she leaves with Gilbert, there's really nothing that I can prove between the years of 1856 and 1875. Harriet's nephew says that she and Gilbert lived in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And they even said Richmond, Virginia for a time. I know it. And then this is all based on letters that Harriet occasionally sent to her sister throughout the years. The nomad story might be true, but I can't find any census records or things to prove it one way or the other. So eventually, Harriet and Gilbert end up in a town called Wheeling, West Virginia. And though by this time, Harriet is actually going by the name Kate Rockwell. So she changes her name. Kate could be a middle name, but I mean, her mother's name was Catherine.
Okay.
So it could be that she was just taking that name on.
Yeah.
But she loses the name Harriet for good all the way up until she dies.
And you know for sure that that's her taking that name and not like a different woman.
Yes, this is what I collect from all of the depositions given by the special examiner. So it's not actually me deducing that. The special examiner deduces that.
Wow.
Wheeling is a really interesting place for this couple to end up. It's sort of universally known to be a debaucherous place.
Yes.
When the U.S. developed their first ever highway, which is the Cumberland Road, and then it was known as the National Road, it originally ended in Wheeling. So in westward expansion, Wheeling became the final stop before the wilderness.
Is that where wheeling and dealing comes from?
God, I hope so. I really hope so for all of our sakes.
Me too.
I mean, as a result, saloons, brothels, etc., were really rampant in this area. So maybe it was. To paint a picture in Wheeling, Virginia, in 1901, the famous temperance activist Carrie Nation, who became famous for being militantly against alcohol, so much so that she hacked down saloons with a hatchet.
Yes.
She visited this city and she called it the wickedest city in the South, a rum-soaked city. And then she just started going down the street and yelling shame, shame, shame all the way down it.
Wow.
She was then arrested for inciting a riot.
Yeah. Big fan.
Carrie Nation is really cool in like her own prudish way.
Wow.
So I just wanted to paint that picture. That's where they ended up.
Yeah. Okay.
So in Wheeling, we get our first and only taste of what Gilbert was like. Kim, this is so crazy. Before I tell you what happens next, I just want to say that I've been researching the people in these episodes for the last over 6 months.
Yeah.
And I was almost done writing this episode, but there was this pull that I was like missing something and it kept nagging at me. And in the 11th hour, I found a series of newspaper articles and it's salacious. So Gilbert Rockwell is arrested and charged for the abduction of a young lady called Miss Barr. And then on top of that, he was charged with assault and battery with an attempt to kill his wife, who was Kate Rockwell.
Oh, no.
Now we know that our shisty Mr. Rockwell stole Harriet away from her home in New York and then eventually tries to kill her. So there are other articles in the years before this incident about a man named Rockwell who gets arrested a couple times for beating his wife in Wheeling. It's not 100% that those are Gilbert, but they probably are.
Yeah.
So by now, Kate's been dealing with an abusive relationship this whole time. The abduction part of the story is never satisfactorily explained, but I'm guessing that the abduction was reported by her family because in the same paper, 3 days later, it seems like Miss Barr is with Gilbert voluntarily. So, Kim, would you read the end of this article? It's just like one sentence.
So this guy is bad. This is bad.
He's bad.
And Gilbert, with the fair damsel who clung to him through the thick and the thin of his troubles, departed together.
And they're talking about Miss Barr there. At the end of their time in Wheeling, they were seen together. She was clinging to him and they left together. Yeah. So it seems like another Harriet situation, right?
No, he's a bad man.
He's a bad man. So it seems like he did the exact same thing to this girl that he did to Harriet. Ooh. Only this time the parents were like, you abducted our daughter.
Well, maybe then that's why Frank thought that she was dead.
Because he's such a bad person.
Well, because she got abducted.
Whoa.
To some extent.
Yeah, but if her cousin said she left
okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, we can put the tinfoil hats down a little bit.
Yeah, okay. I'll smush mine.
Yeah, just smush it a little. So it seems like Gilbert has this pattern of stealing away young women.
And then trying to kill them.
We can't say again what Harriet's feeling at this time, but I imagine she would have thought like, I left everything to be with this man and this is how it turned out.
Oh, bad.
Must have been really, really horrible.
Bad.
Whether Gilbert took off with Miss Barr or Kate left because of the literal murder he attempted, we know that... We know that they part ways for good because in 1875, Kate moves in with a man named Charles Miller and he runs a saloon in Bridgeport, Ohio, which is just across the bridge from Wheeling. Kate and Charles, according to their neighbors, quote, keep house together. So everyone knows they're not really married.
Right.
But they call themselves a married couple. Kate even starts to call herself Kate Miller now. But it's generally known around town that they never got married.
Right.
So I can't say what their relationship was like, but I know that they had a couple of important things in common. Charles originally came from Indiana, where he was born not as Charles, but as Cyrus Miller. So he also changed his name. And in Indiana, after he fights the Civil War, he marries a young woman and they have a son together. And then after 1 year, he just leaves and never returns.
It is an all-star cast. It is winners left and right.
It feels like the Jersey Shore cast at this point. Just bad.
Bad.
So it's very similar to Kate's. And I think this is the period of life where Kate has the closest thing to a normal life that she's ever had.
How old is she at this point?
She probably is in her late 30s, early 40s.
Okay.
The two of them run the saloon together. And they actually take in a young girl and adopt her, not officially, but she does take the last name of Miller and lives with them. And I don't want to over romanticize here, as I am wont to do. Charles is not a knight in shining armor. One time he got run out of Wheeling, West Virginia by the police. So that's why he had a saloon in Bridgeport over the river.
So Wheeling is really just the wild west.
Super is. Charles was a notorious gambler, and he appears in the paper like all the time due to disorderly conduct.
Wow.
So Kate's life is still not idyllic, but he doesn't try to kill her. So I guess there's that we know of.
Yeah.
But she had the saloon. She had an adopted daughter. And for whatever it's worth, she had Charles. So
probably isn't worth much.
Probably not. This was her life for 10 years until Kate developed something called dropsy, which is a condition. Do you know what dropsy is?
We talked about it in a previous episode.
I don't even remember that.
We talked about ovarian dropsy, fluid buildup.
You listen to me.
I do. Because how could I forget the word dropsy?
It's such a fun word for such a bad thing.
For such a bad thing, it is hysterical.
Fluids build up.
Yes.
For Kate, it starts in her feet and then it moves up the body, legs, face, etc.
Okay.
The modern term is edema.
Yes.
And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong along with
No, I think that's right. Like lipedema.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Cool.
You're welcome, doctors.
Yes, doctors. We're doing your work. Almost no one dies of it today. But in 1885, Kate's dropsy was left untreated, which means that it started building fluid up in her lungs, which leads to congestive heart failure.
Yeah.
It's really sad. She dies in April of 1885.
Oh.
7 months later, Charles remarries. And I mean, he legally remarries. He sends a lawyer to Indiana and everything to learn about his first wife and discovers that she actually secured a divorce from him, like without him even being there. So he's free to marry this new wife, which I'm just mentioning this because like, it's hard not to take that personally.
Yeah.
Right. He didn't do that for Kate.
No.
But he did all of that for this new wife. Come on, Charles. It's the definition of if he wanted to, he would, ladies. I know that's right.
Yep.
So unfortunately, things also don't turn out well for Kate's adopted daughter either. At the time of the investigation into Frank's pension, the special examiner learns that she is blind and living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in a house of, quote, ill fame, which is a brothel. So I don't have any official records on her either. So that's the only thing I know about her.
Ooh. Oh,
it's sad.
It's icky.
It's icky. And it's just really sad how those things just like, can just travel through generations, you know? But if we fast forward back to 1915, the special examiner for Helen Dewey's case sends his report to the Commissioner of Pensions. He concludes that whether James Franklin Dewey got a divorce from his first wife is now irrelevant because his wife is conclusively deceased as of 1885.
Okay.
And he recommends that Helen gets put back on the pension payrolls until such time as she is deceased.
Right.
So I'm sure this must have been a relief to Helen, but I also wonder if all of this new information, how it affected her. Her husband had been committing bigamy for close to 30 years. Yeah. Making her marriage to him illegal for that entire time until after 1885, when theirs becomes a common law marriage. So obviously this legal splitting of hairs doesn't like negate the life that they built together. Yeah. But when you're at the end of your life looking back at what you thought your life was, I can't imagine that would be easy.
No.
Just really difficult for her. She lives her final years with this hard-earned pension. She lives in the house of her one daughter, Bernice, and their whole family. And then she passes in 1925, the age of 86, in the town she spent her life in Sydney, New York. I think overall, like, Helen probably had like as much of a life as you can get out of that time period.
It's just a shame to see literal snapshots of her with a look that looks like contentment or love or pride, and then to know that like everything comes into question.
Yeah.
How did Frank die?
Oh, he died of his like ailments from the, like they just kind of built up over time.
Don't you think that he would have wanted to like do a reveal before he passed and tell her the truth?
I mean, maybe he did. We don't really know.
We say of the man who married a 13-year-old.
I know, we can't give him any grace.
I hate it.
That's one of the most frustrating things about digging into genealogy is you'll find pieces of what looks to be like a happy family or something nice. And then you'll discover something that everyone just accepted. That feels really bad.
Awful.
I know. Families are complicated. History is complicated. And it often feels a mixture of the good and the bad.
And women have been getting the short straw for a long time.
For a long time. And it's hard. It's hard. But for me, being able to tell some of their stories helps me come to peace with it. Mm-hmm. And I hope it helps them in a very woo-woo way.
Yeah, sure.
It's time to find resonance, Kim. And I'm wondering if you have any.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
you always do.
You mentioned people being disconnected at this time in history. Mm-hmm. And I think now it is much harder to get away with stuff like that, with changing your name, lying about a marriage, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
I wish that there was any world where Harriet and Helen could have spoken.
Yeah.
Because think about like the Beyonce, Carrie Underwood level duet of revenge that they would inflict on this terrible man.
Yeah.
Even so, even now knowing that it is harder to be caught doing things like this, people are still out here doing it.
Yeah, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?
They sure are getting caught.
Yeah.
And it is so frustrating to me that like, even though the means of communicating are more and the means of like finding the truth are more, there are still people who just think rules don't apply to them. And there's still people who find that they can do what they want regardless of the impact that it has on other people in their lives.
Yes.
And I can't stand it.
I know.
In fact, it's probably getting worse. But again, there's more ways to catch someone in the act of lying.
I think what's so obvious in these stories is that it's just expected. I think there's like an expectation by the women that these men will just live their lives the way that they want to. And they probably wouldn't even think it, but subconsciously they're all acting under this idea that what they can get, like pieces of joy that they can get, they try. And that actually kind of segues into the resonance that I had, which is like the juxtaposition between like Helen and Kate's lives, the like well-behaved woman and the ill-behaved woman. And they have very different outcomes, even though they sort of started at the same exact point. And both of them like married Frank with the promise of like this future as a wife and a mother. And for Kate, she obviously wanted something different, while Helen chose the safety promised to her. Both of them stand in their respective archetype, like squarely in the archetype. But for so much of human history, like women have been relegated to only these two options.
Yes.
And the message that's like told to us over and over again is that if you behave and you choose this archetype, you'll get everything that's promised to you, like home, safety, family.
Yeah.
And if you don't behave, you'll be thrown out and unmoored without any promise of safety or happiness and probably live a life of misery. And unfortunately, these stories substantiate that message to some extent.
Sure.
Even though we don't know what either woman really thought of her life, Kate's life was hard. And we don't know if she would have traded that life for the life that Helen ended up getting.
Yeah.
Helen got everything that she was promised, but like, look what happened at the end of her life. We don't know if she felt fulfilled at the end.
Yeah.
This story would have looked so different if like the world actually had a number of avenues like open to them and they could take the life that they wanted. So yeah, I don't know. I can't blame or fault any of the women for trying to find the like happiness in the ways that Kate tried to find happiness by like bucking the system.
Yeah, of course.
And she did not find it.
Nope.
Helen tried to find happiness inside the system and she might have found it. She might have not found it. We don't know. But I'd like to think that they would both be pleased to see that at least like more avenues have opened up for women. We have so much more work to do. But I mean,
I thought you were saying that as like a positive, like women get to do so much more work now.
Yeah. Could one of the avenues just be no one does work? No. Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, more avenues have opened up for women. And I kind of hope that like there will be 150 years later, 2 women on a podcast talking about the even more number of avenues that are opened up to them.
Yeah.
That's what I have to say about that. That's a foray into the interesting lives of my ordinary ancestors.
Incredible.
Family skeletons, my dude.
I think having the visual, having the snapshot is enough for me to go, I hope Helen was happy. She looked happy. And we can just, that counts for so much, even if it was just a moment in time.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Helen, I hope you're doing okay, girl.
Cheers.
Cheers. All right, let's get out of here. Bye.
Low Ancestry is written and produced by Karyn Harding and co-hosted by me, Kim McMasters, with original music and audio engineering by Benjamin Malk. Original cover art was designed by Christina Swanson of Swansong Creative. Resources pertaining to today's episode and a link to the official bibliography can be found in our show notes or at our website, lowancestry.com. All research was conducted by Karyn, but she's been known to be wrong on occasion. So if you'd like to connect with Karyn or even send her a correction, you can email us at connect@lowancestry.com or find us on Instagram @lowancestry. Genealogy is, after all, a community effort. Thank you so much for listening, and if you like what you hear, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you, and frankly, we really need this.